It's great to be here, and thank you for the introduction, Michael. So, EWEC, Emirates Water and Electricity Company, we're responsible for planning and then implementing the transition from a fully gas system, which is where we were in 2019, to a net zero system in 2050, which the President announced as the country's aspiration at COP28 last December. It's not straightforward. Most of us in this room are in some way involved in planning and then implementing this transition. The process that we use in EWEC is an annual refresh of what do we need to do in order to enable us to obviously hit that long-term objective, but more relevantly in the short term, what do we need to actually go out and buy and procure over the next year before we refresh the next time around? So each year we produce this statement of future capacity requirements, which identifies exactly what we need to do in order to enable us to hit these targets. Now, 2050 is a long way away. I certainly won't be working. I hope I won't be working at that point. But we have an interim target of 2035, which is a lot more meaningful, both for myself and for the rest of the team. 60% clean energy. That basically means that we need to be able to operate a system 100% clean when the sun's shining, and we've got access to cheap solar. So this slide really identifies the starting process. We take a demand forecast, with hourly granularity for power and water, all the way out to 2050. We're talking about 15 years, but actually because of this requirement to identify how do we get to net zero, it's a planning horizon all the way out to 2050. And then we plug in the various other assumptions around what technologies are out there, how much do they cost, what's the gas price, and gas is worth touching on. 10 years ago, I was told by our regulator to take out a recommendation that we should be planning on the opportunity cost of gas, even if we didn't pay it, because it was going to cost the sector more. This year, we're planning on 11% Brent as our marginal gas price, very close to market price, if not market price. And that 11% Brent price is about $2 per MMBTU higher than it was last year. So we are absolutely on the money in terms of planning on the opportunity cost of gas today. And that's a huge transition, if you like, in terms of thinking, for a country that historically has flared gas, has treated gas as a waste product of oil production. So we are now valuing gas, recognizing what it's worth, and actually making it much easier for the power and water sector to transition away from burning it. So integrated planning, that's the team I lead. We sit in the middle and we have three planning objectives: security of supply, least cost, and these carbon objectives, sustainability. We have to balance those, and I will touch a little bit on how we do that in the next 10 minutes or so. So that techno-economic interface with operational planning is really what we talk about, what we mean when we're talking about integrated planning. We're planning a system, we're not just building capacity. Now, for 40 years, EWEC built another thermal cogeneration plant. Cogeneration, i.e. we produced water from the heat that came out of the back end of the gas turbine, used that to boil water, boil seawater to produce drinking water. That process is rapidly coming to an end. In 2019, 85% of the water that we produced came from boiling seawater and condensing it. By 2030, 95% of water will be produced by standalone membrane-based processes. That's an amazing transition in a 10-year period. 10 years ago from now, I was being told it didn't work, it was too expensive, it wasn't going to be reliable enough. So in the space of 10 years, we have come to the position where water now is going to be transitioning to a membrane-based desalination. So that process leads to outputs from our PLEXOS model, and that says, right, you need to build the following set of capacity. But the reality is that operating a system that's going to involve a lot of nuclear, a lot of solar, and a lot of batteries has very different operability challenges to a gas-based system that has, from a legacy perspective, always provided all of those ancillary services that we need. So the planning team is now needing to look at, in quite some granularity and detail, at what are the operability challenges for the system going to be in the future. And that is really, I think, the future direction in terms of system planning, is how do we integrate the techno-economic outputs that are coming from PLEXOS with the operability challenges in terms of what the system is actually going to be doing when we're pumping large amounts of solar PV through that system every morning as the sun comes up, and then we're replacing it either with batteries or with gas-fired generation at the moment, or with something else that we don't know about in the future. So this is, the top slide there, power supply. You can see there's a nice trajectory. We're starting in 2050, working back and saying, well, what do we need to do in order to get there? So clearly, that graph shows that we're going to have a lot more clean energy by 2050, because that's the target. If that target gets moved, we're in a position to adjust it, whether it goes earlier or later. Well, what you can see is that by 2030, nuclear plus renewables is about half of the total energy. We wouldn't be able to achieve that unless water production was totally decoupled from power production. So the bottom graph is showing the very rapid transition away from thermal cogeneration of water. Now, I've spent much of this week reviewing the 30,000-word statement that we produce and submit to the regulator by the end of May each year. This is last year's. So if you look at 2030 solar, we're seeing 5 gigawatts of solar being recommended on top of the 2.5 that we already have today. So the recommendation this time last year was that we would have 7.5 gigawatts of solar. The submission we're about to make in a few days' time is recommending 13 gigawatts of solar. Why has that changed? It's changed because the price of gas CCGTs is significantly higher. The last CCGT plant we did in Abu Dhabi, the capex cost was around $440 per kilowatt hour. We're now expecting that to be more than double. The cost of solar PV has come down, and the cost of gas itself, as I mentioned earlier, has gone up. So that's driving more solar PV into the system, and it's basically enabling us to say, okay, we need a lot more capacity. But that in itself is going to present challenges in terms of how do we operate the system with 13 gigawatts of solar, and how do we actually build it? There are going to be supply chain constraints. Despite the 500 gigawatts of global PV capacity, just the physical ability to build 3 or more gigawatts of new solar capacity every year for the next 10 years is going to be hugely challenging. When I joined what was then Abu Dhabi Water and Electricity Company, it only became EWEC in 2018, we were 58 people, and I reckon there were about 6 people doing anything in that business. We are now close to 500. Okay, we've become a system operator as well, so the control room has been taken out of the transmission business, and we've been told, right, you've got to operate the system that you're planning. So it's been a total transformation. But nevertheless, what this slide illustrates is we've come from a world where we were building one thermal cogen plant a year or 2, every year or every 2 years. Now we are potentially in a position where we're going to need to be running 15 projects in parallel. I arrived in 2004. The peak demand in Abu Dhabi at that time was 4,302 megawatts. At 2 a.m. 3 weeks ago, the CEO gets a call from Data AI, G42, which is the company that Abu Dhabi is using to develop Data AI, and we were asked to provide 5 gigawatts by 2028. Now, I don't think there are many places in the world who could actually, well, I don't think it's possible to do 2028, but maybe 2030. But one of the reasons why Abu Dhabi is such an exciting place to be from a power system planning perspective is that the aspiration, the money, and the political will to do things is so strong. So the challenge of decarbonisation, I mean, Michael touched on the fact that there's a bit of a customer backlash to this. I think the backlash occurs at the point where customers start to pay more than they would have paid. When we set that 60% clean energy target in 2035, that was really based on the idea that we could get to 60% without it costing any more than if we'd just stuck with the alternative. That has now moved to 65%, simply as a consequence of gas becoming more expensive and solar becoming cheaper. That's before we factor in the cost of storage, which has fallen about 40% in the last 4 months. So I suspect we will see our ability to achieve higher levels of decarbonisation before we start incurring an incremental cost to end consumers as technologies emerge and prices continue to fall. Certainly, we've gone from 60% to 65% in the last 12 months. It will be interesting to see once we've got prices for the latest solar plants this year, which I'm looking forward to because I suspect we may get below that 1 cent per kilowatt hour, $10 per megawatt hour soon due to this oversupply in the market. Battery prices are falling. Gas prices are still quite high. So there's a nice set of conditions that will actually conspire to enabling us to do more from a decarbonisation perspective before we start going on this top part of the curve. But I think the reality is it's still going to be very expensive to get from 90% to 100%. But let's aim for the stars, and if we end up with 90%, let's call that the moon. That will be just a tremendous opportunity, and I think for most of us, our careers are going to be spent managing the transition from where we are now to the 80-90% area, and if we can facilitate that, we need to leave something for our children to do. Okay, so one of the key challenges we face is gas flexibility. Gas, I mean, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber is the CEO of ADNOC. He was also the founder of Masdar, the founding chairman of Masdar. He stood up in 2009 at the first World Future Energy Summit and said, we're going to do 7% clean energy by 2020. We actually hit it in 2021 or halfway through 2021. So it wasn't far off. But that was purely driven by the first project. What this graph is showing that by 2028, we're going to be very close to 95% clean energy running during daytime hours. We hit 83% last November with the first 2 projects. But the challenge from a gas supply perspective is that we need to be able to ramp the gas almost exclusively off during February when the AC cooling load is low, and then bring it back on. So the bottom graph there, 2035, that black line is showing our gas offtake. So it starts high, it drops off entirely during the day, and then it ramps up again at night very quickly. The gas supply business, which we don't own, it's run by the state oil company, is not capable of providing that at the moment. So we've got 2.5 gigawatts of solar PV. I'm not sure this hasn't got a pointer, is it? No. We've got 2.5 gigawatts of solar PV. That uses up 100% of our existing gas flexibility. By 2030, we will have more than 7 gigawatts. That's 2.5 times more gas flexibility than exists in the current system. By 2033, we will be at 6 times. This is a real challenge, and if we can't solve this, we will either have to substitute storage, battery storage, for that gas capacity much sooner than we'd otherwise planned, or else we're going to end up curtailing a lot of solar and burning more gas, so the system cost will go up in the region of 20% simply on account of curtailed solar. So effectively, that will slow down the decarbonisation trajectory. So what do we need to do to get us further? I've broken this down into 4 pillars. We need to be able to see the future. So that's scenario modelling. How will we get there? At the moment, lots of nuclear really is the only surefire, guaranteed way of actually getting to net zero in 2050. That'll result in our costs of energy increasing from around $30 per megawatt hour average cost today to around $120 per megawatt hour in 2050 at today's prices. Is that palatable? That's not our call. That's just what it will be. That's the reality. If we defer making that commitment to nuclear today, we have the optionality, or we gain the optionality of these emerging prices and these potential falls in storage costs. I won't talk about resilience, but that will obviously be a big challenge. We then need to be able to build this capacity. I mean, building 13 gigawatts of solar by 2030, multiple gigawatt hours of battery storage by the early 2030s, adding a lot of CCGT because we still need to supply energy at night, assuming the gas flexibility is there. So building it is a real challenge. And then we've got this challenge of operability. And I think most system operators are only just waking up to just how extensive those challenges are when we're trying to run a system that's got a lot of variable renewables in them at very high penetrations. We need to be operating at over 95% clean for most of the time to be close to this sort of 65%. And the final leg of this is the data and digitalization. Without the control systems and the planning systems, the planning tools, if you like, that will enable us to figure out what will the system actually look like in 4 years' time when we've gone from 10% clean to 50% clean to close to 100% clean during those periods. What does the system look like, and how do we make sure that the tools to ensure operability are in place? So at the moment we use an economic dispatch tool, and it dispatches based on a merit order of cost. I think the future dispatch tool is likely to be security-constrained dispatch, which looks at have we got enough system reliability and have we got the balancing tools in place that enable us to keep track of what's going on in the system. So our dispatch needs to be ensuring that this dashboard in the middle here, under system reliability and system balancing, is adequately managed. Now, PLEXOS clearly is sitting there as a planning tool at the moment. Whether it gets integrated and used more fully in the future as a system dispatch tool by integrating it with others that are giving us views on system strength and voltage control and stability and so on, that remains to be seen, and it's certainly an area for exploration. Looking at what we're doing internally within EWEC, back in 2020, 2019, we first moved to PLEXOS from PREL. We didn't start off with PLEXOS because it didn't offer the water co-optimization at the time that we started in 2015. But we were running on 2 laptops, and we're now running on a cloud-based, Azure-based infrastructure and looking to pilot the Energy Exemplar cloud system. But our compute requirements are increasing exponentially year on year, and I think this shows you that. The right-hand graph there for 2023, that's a logarithmic scale. So, we have increased by an order of magnitude in terms of our compute requirements every year, and we are nowhere near the granularity required in terms of outputs to enable us to operate or plan the system when we've got the high levels of renewable penetration that we need in the future. So what do we need? I mean, basically, this is summarizing. We obviously need hardware improvements, which is why we're looking at cloud infrastructure. We have a team of about three analysts who spend most of their time working on just improving the underlying modeling infrastructure itself, what the model is actually doing and how that integrates back into PSSE and Power Factory in the future. It's PSSE at the moment. And we're obviously working closely with the team in Energy Exemplar to improve the software itself. So my concluding slide here is there isn't really a pathway to net zero. I mean, it's a bit like driving through the desert. We are trying to find a path. We're trying to find a track which doesn't exist. There's no right answer. An answer could be nuclear. There's a lot of debate at the moment internally within Abu Dhabi about how much nuclear we're actually going to need to enable us to get there. But what this illustrates in this very faint outline of a path here is we're making a lot of progress. We need to decouple water production. That will be completed in the late 2020s. We are going to need to reorganize ourselves so that we can integrate more fully as a system operator with the luxury of also acting as a single procurer or a single buyer. So we work out what we want, we go and build it, and then we operate it. By 2035, we need to be in a position to operate 100% clean, or very close to 100% clean, for every hour that the sun is shining and we don't have a dust storm. Some wind will need to be added as well, and then we will need to be implementing storage at scale progressively during the 2030s and 2050s. So the pathway will get updated every year. We're moving now. We've got that aspiration I talked about earlier, and that I think is a major attraction of working in Abu Dhabi. The pace of change is just extraordinary. But I would be fascinated to hear your perspectives from your different entities as well. There's a lot we can learn from each other on this journey ahead. Thank you very much.
So first of all, Bruce, thank you for an inspiring presentation. We do have some time for questions, so I'm sure there are many questions in the audience, and I would encourage everyone to speak up. Because we're blinded by the brilliance in the room here, need a clear signal with your hands if you have any questions. There's one. Perfect. And we have, as you can see, roving microphones. Just get out of your way.
Oh, thanks for the presentation. It was very good. My name's Tom Edwards from Cornwall Insight. I was wondering, how do you account for any sort of interconnection between neighbouring markets? Because that would potentially help with sharing the burden of managing your gas if you are close enough to link up with anyone. But there are some really long HVDC cables being built around the world now. Are you including that in your long-term planning?
Sure. I mean, we have interconnections between Abu Dhabi and the rest of the UAE. I mean, we are now EWEC, not Abu Dhabi Water and Electricity Company. So we're interconnected with Dubai, and we supply all of the power to the Northern Emirates, apart from Sharjah, which has self-generation for about half. So interconnection within UAE itself isn't bad, and most of those constraints can largely be removed in the next 10 years or so, or 5 years if we're a bit more aggressive. There are some interconnections with Oman. Oman has an extraordinarily good wind resource. I mean, during the summer months when it's very hot in Abu Dhabi, and we've got 60% of our load is cooling related, there is a 25-knot wind that blows from May through till September with about a 70% load factor resulting on the wind on an annual basis. So it's close to 90% during that period. It would be amazing to interconnect, but the transmission requirements are expensive. And at the moment, if you remember that graph that I was showing, it's cheaper to just focus on putting as much solar into the system as we can until we've exhausted the value that the solar provides. Now, Saudi is obviously a 60-gigawatt system. It's on the doorstep. It would make a lot more sense to increase the level of interconnection above the 1.2 gigawatts that currently exists through the GCC-IA interconnection today. But their challenges are very similar, and that's the problem. You know, there isn't a great deal of disconnect, if you like, in the timing of when that energy is available. We looked at running a subsea interconnection to India. Our friend Adani was very keen on laying this very expensive undersea cable at 3.5 kilometers below the surface. The challenge is that in terms of time difference for solar or wind produced in India, sending it to Abu Dhabi, there just wasn't enough to actually make it financially viable. So the arbitrage play wasn't big enough. So it's something we'll explore. It's something that needs to be built out and enhanced. But I think that my initial focus would be on the local regional interconnections. So Saudi, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman. If we can interconnect more fully there, it'll certainly help, but not to the extent that it does in Europe.
Now, Gerasimos, I think you also need to wait for a microphone, just a second. We need one up front here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It was very informative and very insightful on what you're doing, very challenging. I hope we can exchange views in the discussion later on. But just a quick question is, and how do you cope with gas flexibility? The storage is UGS, it is, what else do you have? Do you have LNG coming or something that you can use in
Yeah, so as in most power systems, there's a lot of politics between institutions or entities. Now, ADNOC is responsible, then the state oil company is responsible for owning, maintaining, operating, and supplying gas to the interface point with the various power plants. So we act as the single buyer for all of the fuel on behalf of the power plants. So we group together all of the gas demand from the various power plants, and we go to ADNOC and say, this is the expected demand profile for gas on an hourly basis for the next 5 years. We need a gas contract from you. And they're saying, okay, we want you to be within 3% of that gas profile, please. Otherwise, there's take or pay. Their own demand variability is something like 30% per year away from what they're asking for. So what they're giving us is not what they are offering us in terms of their own demand. But the point to make is that we've been giving ADNOC the view on gas flexibility requirements now on an hourly basis for the last 5 years. I think they're waking up to the fact now that we've exhausted all of the flexibility that their existing system provides, that things are going to need to look very different. And I think the CEO of ADNOC, also being the CEO of, or the chairman of Masdar, also being obviously running COP28 on behalf of the UAE, decarbonization for Dr. Sultan is very important, and he sees gas as a transition fuel. So I'm confident that with his support, ADNOC as an entity will invest the time, and I think it's time, not money here. The cost of these compressors, the cost of building these underground geological structures that we can use for intraday gas flexibility is not high. It really isn't in the grand scheme of things, but it will require quite a lot of time in planning to actually deliver it. And ADNOC are looking at this saying, the margins on this are tiny. You know, as an oil company, they're used to making a lot of money, but the technical challenges are quite high. So they need to spend a lot of time with not much return, and they can see that in 10 years' time, we may have migrated away almost completely from gas burn. So it's an interesting organizational challenge. I don't think the technical challenge is insurmountable by any stretch. It's just, is the will there to actually make it happen, given that they'd rather be making millions somewhere else?
Mm-hmm. To be continued in the panel later, I would say. Any other, perhaps, we probably have time for, maybe 2 more questions. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm from the electricity system operator in Great Britain. We don't have the same problems with water as you, of course, blessed with lots of rain. But I'm interested in, with your move to osmosis, is there any ability for flexibility for electricity that comes from that large electricity demand?
Yeah, it's a really good question. RO, you can turn it off and you can turn it on, and it runs on electricity. Would it pay to build more RO capacity, for example, and run that RO capacity on solar, and then reduce output during night, when at the moment we'd be running either on gas or stored energy or nuclear, all of which are more expensive? The short answer is the CapEx-OpEx trade-off doesn't really support that, because ironically, RO is now so energy efficient. I mean, we're looking at 25 kilowatt hours per cubic meter of water from a thermal desal process and 3 for an RO process. So if you're 3 kilowatt hours per cubic meter, if we turn off our largest, of course we do the largest, we go from no to building the world's largest, and it's 50% bigger than anybody else had ever built at the point where we said, yes, we'll do it. But that plant, 200 million gallons, 900,000 cubic meters a day, that plant is, you can do the maths yourself, but it works out less than 100 megawatts. So in a system of 18 gigawatts, it's not really that material. There is some, but not enough to make a material difference, and it's not worth overbuilding RO capacity in order to take advantage of cheap energy at the moment.
Perfect. I think we have time for one final question. Yes, up front.
Hello, John from Economic Consulting Associates. I think at the very end of your speech, you threw in a big question mark around nuclear there, and that there's big discussions. I think in many of the countries we've worked in, it does make the challenge very different. It's a different beast to tackle if nuclear does happen or not, if it's large or small. I guess just a general question, how do you manage that as part of this process. There's probably a lot of politics involved, but you want your voice to be heard as well. Questions like large nuclear SMRs or not, when do they appear? And they obviously have long lead times, and they change everything you've just mentioned in a big fashion. So you'll need different types of flexibility or BESS if X happens or not. So maybe a bit around that. And it's just a general thing we see in, everybody talks about net zero, but if nuclear does go ahead or not, and hydrogen you mentioned as well, that does change things massively. And these are big strategic questions that hopefully should be answered sooner rather than later for people like yourselves to make the right planning and operational decisions. Thank you.
Yes, that's another really good question. How much nuclear do we build, and what's our role in recommending it? So a lot of the discussions that I've been having this week back with the leadership team has been, how do we position nuclear as a recommendation? And of course, that depends on the assumptions that you take, obviously, but the only world in which we wouldn't recommend a lot of nuclear, and by a lot, just from a lot to a huge amount, is one in which you bet the house on new technologies, storage technologies being available to enable you to actually manage the system and get that large quantity of energy, clean energy, into the system. And that technology just isn't available today at a price that makes any sense. So the price that you pay for nuclear in the planning recommendation isn't that sensitive. When we're at the price of Baraka, we're assuming, say, $5,600 gives you an $85 a megawatt hour. That's cheap by UK standards, but it's still double what we're paying in the system, more than double what we're paying in the system. So it's doubling our costs, tripling our costs by 2050. What is the alternative? There really isn't one. So unless you're prepared to be very ballsy in terms of taking that bet that those technologies are going to be available that will give you that option, it doesn't really matter whether it's $2,500 per kilowatt hour, per kilowatt of capacity, or $8,000 per kilowatt. You still need nuclear if you're serious about net zero in 2050. Because frankly, what is the alternative? We don't have pumped hydro, available clearly. So, there's just no alternative at the moment.
Okay. Perfect. With that, Bruce, thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael.